For a long time, the Strv 81 RB-52 was the only Tier 4 premium available to buy for the British tech tree, but with the addition of the Centurion Action 10, which tank gets the accolade of the best Tier 4 British premium. Alright lads, today I'm going to be talking about the history, performance, weapons and tactics of this vehicle. Like usual, we'll start with the basics. The Strv 81 RB-52 is a rank 4 battle rating 6.7 medium tank, located in the British tech tree. As I mentioned, this is a premium vehicle, and must be bought from a pack on the Guardian store. For the price of €40, you get the tank, 1000 Golden Eagles, and 7 days of premium time. Due to its premium status, you also get the reward modifiers higher than the regular tech tree vehicles, with the Strv 81 getting a 552% RP modifier and a 420% Silverline modifier. With the Centurion Action 10 costing roughly €33 worth of Golden Eagles, having the same gun and even having a slightly better RP modifier, is the Strv 81 still a relevant premium? If you'd like to know more about this tank and whether it's worth its €40 price tag, then stick around for the rest of the video. At the end of World War II, the Swedish arsenal of armoured vehicles was quite diverse, consisting of several tank designs, made by several different designers. For any army, having many different tanks, which require different parts and tools, is a logistical nightmare. The Weapons Bureau of the Army Administrative Service, known as the KAFT, conducted a study that concluded the most cost-effective way of replacing Sweden's tank forces would be to purchase the new British Centurion Mark III. The Centurion, with its impressive combat record in Korea, was picked not only for being one of the most modern tanks available, but it was also seen as being easily upgradable for any future threats. Sweden contacted the British and inquired about purchasing the Centurion tank. However, they were told that they would need to wait anywhere from 5 to 15 years. This was due to Britain wanting to fully replace its own old tank fleets with modern Centurions, and Britain did not have the manufacturing capability to produce enough for both countries at the same time. KAFT concluded that waiting 15 years to produce a new tank was unacceptable, and in 1951 set about creating a domestically produced Swedish tank. The tank that was in development was given the codename of Emil and/or KRV. In 1952, the British suddenly changed their minds and would allow Sweden to start receiving the Centurions immediately. This was due to the British economy being rather poor, and the British government was in dire need of securing foreign currency. Sweden ordered 80 Centurion Mark IIIs in late 1952 and began receiving them in 1953. The Centurions in Swedish service were given the designation of Strv-81 or Stridsvagn 81. Several years later, in 1955, Sweden ordered 160 Centurion Mark Vs, and then again later in 1960, several Centurion Mark Xs were ordered, as well as all of the previously acquired Mark III and Mark V tanks being upgraded and fitted with the Royal Ordnance L7 105mm gun. The previously mentioned Emil project was cancelled in 1952 when the deal was made to purchase Centurions. However, it was reopened late in the 1950s when Sweden wanted to start developing the replacement to the Centurion tank. However, it lost the contract to the famous S-tank. While the S-tank was designed to replace the Centurions, when the S-tank entered service in the early 1970s, the Centurions were kept in service right up into the 1990s. Both the S-tank and the Centurion were replaced in Swedish service by the German-made Leopard 2, which Sweden still uses to this day. The tank we have in game is the Strv 81 RB-52. This means that it is essentially a carbon copy of the British Centurion Mark III, found in the regular British tech tree. Being a copy of the Centurion Mark III, it uses the same engine producing 650 horsepower. Combined with the tank's weight of 50.8 tonnes, it gives this vehicle a pretty poor power to weight ratio of 12.8 horsepower per tonne. With such a low power to weight ratio, your manoeuvrability resembles more of a heavy tank than a medium tank. Your top speed is also rather poor, with a measly 35 km per hour. This is slower than most of the German heavy tanks. You do have a pretty decent reverse speed however, with 12 km per hour, which is a nice change for anyone used to playing the low tier British tanks. This tank does get neutral steering, which certainly is a positive, but with such a low power to weight ratio, you can only manage a traverse rate of around 18 degrees per second. Overall, the low engine power of this tank is a significant letdown, and severely limits your playstyle and role on the battlefield. Just like the rather underwhelming engine performance, the armoured protection the Stridsvagn offers isn't amazing for battle rating 6.7. Starting with the lower frontal plate, you can see that it is only 3 inches or 76mm thick. It is however quite sloped at 47 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 128mm. Moving up the hull to the upper frontal plate, We have the same 3 inches of armour, however it is sloped slightly more at 58 degrees, giving it 132mm of effective thickness. The sides of the Stridsvagn are only 2 inches, or 50mm thick, and are virtually unsloped, and the rear and roof of the hull is even worse, with 38mm and 14mm respectively. Things start to look a bit better when we move on to the turret. The Stridsvagn gets a pretty substantial gun mantlet that overlaps most of the flat face of the turret. The flattest part of the mantlet is 152mm thick, but like the early Churchill tanks, it is completely flat. You do get a patch of armour surrounding the machine gun that is 200mm thick. This is pretty trolly, and you can bounce shot regularly if the enemy is stupid enough to shoot you here. The top and bottom of the mantlet are not as thick as the centre. The thickness drops down substantially to only 100mm, but it is angled at around 38 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 129mm. The upper part of the turret is only 50mm thick, but it is very well sloped at 70 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of 165mm. Being angled at 70 degrees, the upper part of the turret is very good for bouncing incoming rounds, but like the additional machine gun armour, you have to rely on enemies being dumb enough to shoot you there. At 6.7, pretty much every medium and heavy tank will be able to penetrate you from the front. You do have a few trolly areas, but even the thickest parts of your mantlet are usually not enough to save you. But even if you do come across an opponent who cannot penetrate your mantlet, they will still be able to punch right through your turret neck. Just below the mantlet is a pretty large and visible strip of armour that is only 89mm thick. Like the turret neck, the sides and rear of the turret share the same 89mm of armour protection. Overall, for 6.7, the armour protection is pretty good compared to contemporary medium tanks, but this tank meets the German long 88s pretty much every game, which basically negates your armour. Whilst the other 6.7 mediums can rely on their speed and manoeuvrability to keep themselves out of danger, you do not have that luxury due to your poor engine performance. With the armour and mobility of the Stridsvagn 81 being covered, the tank isn't looking too good, but the firepower of this tank is where it really makes a name for itself. Firstly, the main gun. You have the same 84mm 20-pounder OQF Mark I gun found on the Centurion Mark III, albeit under a Swedish designation. It has 10 degrees of gun depression and 20 degrees of gun elevation, making it very capable of working a ridgeline. It is also housed in a turret with a traverse rate of 19 degrees per second. This quick turning turret, combined with the fact this gun is fully stabilised, allows you to pull off some ridiculous snapshots, whether it be round corners or over ridgelines. Whereas other tanks would have to stop and let their gun level out, this tank can stop and fire accurately almost instantly. And with a fire rate of 6.7 seconds, you can put a lot of accurate fire down range in a very short period of time. You have 4 different types of ammunition for the main gun. Your standard round is the British Shot Mark I, an armour-piercing capped ballistic cap shell. This contains no explosive filler, but from my personal experience it is still very deadly. At 10 metres it has 232mm of penetration, and a muzzle velocity of 1000 metres per second, making it incredibly user-friendly both at short and long range. The second round is the Shot Mark III, an armour-piercing discarding sabre round, with 285mm of penetration. The Shot Mark III obviously has more penetration than the Shot Mark I, but the trade-off when using APDS is that the round has more penetration for the cost of reduced post-penetration damage. I typically use the APDS Shot Mark III as my standard round, mainly because of the many opponents you will meet at 6.7 using angled armour, and the Shot Mark III's round higher penetration significantly improves the chances that my first round will penetrate. The final 2 rounds are more like utility rounds. You get access to a high explosive shell with 15mm of penetration. I feel like this round is pretty redundant. It could be used against soft targets, such as Soviet trucks and open tank destroyers, but you also carry a single machine gun which works just as well. The last round is a smoke shell. It is pretty good for what it is, and it has a smoke holding time of 20 seconds, which allows you to move from cover to cover or blind opponents for a significant amount of time. However, the first 2 shells are the workhorses of this tank. Their high penetration and high velocity allows you to pull off some longer range shots with ease. This is also helped with a fairly good 6 times max zoom of your aiming reticle. As I mentioned, you also get a standard rifle caliber machine gun, specifically a 7.92 Beezer machine gun. This is fairly slow firing and is pretty much useless apart from shooting at gas trucks and taunting enemies. It has no functional role against lightly armoured tanks or in the anti-air role. The last weapon system available to the Stridsvagn 81 are the RB-52 rockets mounted on its turret. These are early anti-tank missiles, and therefore have to be aimed with your WASD keys on your keyboard. This can be quite tricky, and I would always recommend using your gun against opponent who is moving rather than these missiles. However, against opponents who are camping, they are very deadly. If you aim your reticle at an opponent and fire, the missile will generally guide themselves to where you are aiming. Some minor corrections will need to be made, but they generally work very well. One caveat to this is that they cannot be fired at close range targets. The missiles launch up into the air and then start guiding, so there is a minimum distance needed for them to be effective. If you fire at an enemy that is too close, the missile will simply pass straight over their roof. The missiles themselves are pretty powerful, having a warhead with 3.5 kilograms of TNT and 600mm of penetration. This means they can penetrate everything you will meet on the battlefield, as long as you can hit them. Overall, the weapons you have at your disposal are very effective. You have a fully stabilised, fast-firing, high-penetration gun, as well as deadly anti-tank missiles. It's fair to conclude from the review so far that this tank has great firepower, but rather lacking in armour and mobility, and we must adapt our playstyle to suit these traits. When I spawn into a game, I usually take around 20 APDS rounds and a few APC-BC rounds as backup. This tank should not be used as a spearhead of an attack, instead letting friendly heavies to bear the brunt of the enemies. This tank is ideally placed on the flank, preferably in a position that allows you to put your fast-firing, high-pen gun to work. Realistically, this tank works best as a long-range sniping tank, as it allows you to hide your weak spots. However, in close quarters your gun is fully stabilised and can penetrate pretty much anything you will meet. But it does not have the armour to bounce shots, so if you do run into an enemy, you will probably get the first shot off, and as long as you aim to either kill their gunner or cannon breach, you should win the engagement. But this type of combat is far from ideal, and you should try to avoid it at all costs. I play the Stridsvagn and the other British medium tanks with much more caution than I play other medium tanks of other nations. Double checking every corner is a necessity, as if you get caught with your pants down, as I've mentioned nearly 1,000 times in this review by now, you don't have the manoeuvrability or armour to get yourself out alive. As I mentioned earlier, the RB-52 anti-tank missile should only be used against static targets at medium ranges. At close and long range, your main gun is far easier to aim and far easier to get reliable kills with. While the RB-52s may be the party piece of this tank, the overwhelming majority of my kills come from the main gun, and the missile should be thought of as a novelty rather than the go-to weapon system. In terms of lineups, the British 6.7 lineup is probably the peak of the British tank tech tree. The only thing Britain lacks at 6.7 is an effective light tank. However, this can be substituted by the Charioteer. You have the Centurion Mark III, FV-4202, Carnarvon, Tortoise, FV-405 and the Charioteer all in the regular tech tree, as well as the premium Centurion Action 10, giving you a very competent lineup if they are played with caution and patience. As well as the great tank lineup, you also have the excellent Spitfire Mark 24 for a fighter, and the old faithful Wyvern as a close air support weapon. To conclude, I think the Stridsvagn 81 is a very good tank, and I personally enjoy playing it, but without sounding arrogant, it does take some skill to get the best performance out of it. It needs to be played cautiously. Your gun is amazing, but you usually need more than one shot to kill an opponent, whereas they typically only need one shot to kill you. When it comes to this tank or the Centurion Action 10, the difference between the two tanks are incredibly small, and do not affect the way they are both played. All of the criticism I have for the Stridsvagn 81 is also relevant for the Centurion Action 10. Both have great guns, but lack armour and manoeuvrability. I use both the Stridsvagn and the Action 10 in my lineup, and when I die in one, I'll take out the other and play them the exact same way. The Stridsvagn does get access to the anti-tank missiles, but is that worth an extra €7? I'm not sure it is. I said in my review of the Centurion Action 10 that I would pick that tank over the Stridsvagn, and that is purely just down to the Action 10 being slightly cheaper, as there is no notable difference in performance between them. For people looking for a cheaper alternative to both, putting a talisman on the Centurion Mark III or any of the other British 6.7 tanks is pretty much just as effective in my opinion. They all use the same great gun and all have the same playstyle. The only thing you would lack is the higher Silver Lion reward modifier. Putting a talisman on a 6.7 tank will cost you around €14 worth of Golden Eagles, which is significantly cheaper than either the Action 10 or the Stridsvagn 81. I think the price tag of €40 for the Stridsvagn is quite high, and only really worth paying if you have a genuine interest in the British tech tree. For the same price you could get the T-29 in the American tech tree, the German Tiger II SLA, or the IS-6 in the Soviet tech tree if you're a dirty communist. I bought the Stridsvagn 81 when it was the only Tier 4 premium, and used it to grind out pretty much all of the British tech tree. I play the British 6.7 lineup pretty frequently, and I really enjoy it. But I'm a British main, so I am obviously quite biased. But I hope you found this video useful, lads, and thank you very much for watching.